Hey, what's up, everyone? This story took me a while to write. I hope y'all enjoy it. If y'all don't, or if y'all do, leave a comment down below. It's a little different. It's sort of an experimental piece. But anyway, as always, like, share, subscribe, comment. And without further ado, let's get on with the story. One more thing before I forget. If you're feeling generous, you can purchase some merchandise in the link in the description below. Thanks, everyone. Heartless. Chapter 1. Yang stood by his desk, trembling in the darkness of his office with a pistol in hand. He had his finger on the trigger, aiming it directly at the door as he waited for the intruder to step through. He hadn't felt so alone, so vulnerable, and so fearful since he was a child. The emotions seemed almost foreign to him, and he was having difficulty handling them. Many years have come and gone since he took over his old boss's position as head of the White Dragon Gang. Though he faced many dangers in the past, Yang never really felt threatened since he had the protection of his men. He himself was also as formidable, if not more so, than any of his enemies. But this new threat was different somehow. With his last two remaining guards gone, Yang was all by himself. The guards stepped out into the hall and had not been heard from since. The last thing he heard were a series of gunshots. Now, the only thing he could hear was the accelerated drumming of his own heart and the thunderstorm from outside. The only light source was from the lightning through the huge windows of his office. It was all he had to rely on since the storm knocked out the power. The generator came on for a brief moment, 30 minutes earlier, but that was also cut short, followed by their communications being interrupted by a voice of a woman crying and pleading for her life. The message kept replaying on all their communications equipment, like their walkie-talkies, cell phones, and even on their radios without power. The voice began to laugh maniacally. The men thought it was some sort of prank at first, until each of their comrades started disappearing one by one. Just then the doorknob rattled, and without hesitation, Yang fired several rounds at it. The door slowly creaked open as a shadowy figure emerged from it and limped toward him. Though it was dark, he could make out the silhouette of the figure. Yang fired a few more shots at the being until it finally went down with a thud. He breathed hard, trying to catch his breath. Sweat poured from his brow and dripped off his chin. Thunder boomed, shaking the foundation of the building, and lightning flashed multiple times, revealing the corpse of one of his missing guards. Ying cursed in frustration. Suddenly, the big window behind him imploded, spraying 1,000 shards of glass throughout the room, dragging the storm in with it. The kingpin immediately spun and aimed his weapon, but it was knocked hard to the floor by his assailant, flying through the window before he could get a shot off. His gun went skidding across the room. He flipped onto his knees and scrambled after it. Ying was in arm's reach, but stopped in his tracks when a pair of dark legs stepped in front of him. One of them had his gun pinned underneath its foot. Before he could react, the being delivered a devastating roundhouse kick to his face. Ying felt the painful impact on the right side of his face, and a flash of white light crossed his vision. He grunted in pain from a hard kick to the right side of his torso, knocking the wind out of him. He took another, then another. Ying was anticipating another blow, but it never came. Instead, he felt something sharp sink into his back multiple times, and he yelled in agony. Whether they were claws or fangs, he couldn't tell. He rolled away from his attacker, then rose quickly to his feet. But Ying was lightheaded, so he wobbled backwards and crashed into the desk behind him. Ying's vision blurred, and he could hardly move at that point. Though his vision wasn't 100%, he could make out a form of a woman in the darkness. She had a set of glowing, fiery red almond-shaped eyes and matted hair, and it terrified him. One of her arms had a sharp point to it. He figured it must be some sort of talon. She slowly made her way to him as if savoring each second. His eyes widened at the sight of the supernatural being as lightning flashed repeatedly, transforming it into an actual woman before his eyes. In her hand was a knife. The woman was unfamiliar to him. She was young, probably half his age. She had jet black hair and a tight-fitting dark-colored jumpsuit that outlined her fit and slender frame. She was soaked from head to toe from the rain, and though some of the contents had washed off, there was still a considerable amount of blood on her. Some of it hers, but most of it from her victims. The woman looked like a vampire in the strobing pale stormlight. Most people would have been intimidated by the sight of her, but Ying wasn't. In fact, he gained a new-found confidence. It was just a woman after all, the man thought to himself as he uttered a crazed laugh. But she remained as stoic as could be. The woman raised her knife and brought it down with all her might on her would-be victim. But Ying was ready and evaded the attack as the knife embedded itself into the desk with a crunch. She tried working the blade out for another attack, and he seized the opportunity to go on the offensive. Ying tackled the woman onto the floor, but she was an experienced fighter and braced herself against him. As soon as they hit the floor, she used the momentum to try to roll on top of him, but he had the same idea. They tussled around the floor for a position, slipping and sliding from the rain. Ying was twice her size and eventually got the better of her. She was at least able to maneuver into half guard, keeping the man pinned between her legs. He hit the woman with a series of punches aimed at her face. She managed to deflect and evade some of the blows, which was a testament of her martial prowess. But a few punches got through, smashing her in the face repeatedly. Blood ran from her nostrils, off the sides of her face, and down her throat, leaving a salty metallic taste in her mouth. She could feel the increasing warmth building above her eye and cheekbone as she continued defending against his ongoing attacks. "Die, bitch, die!" an enraged Ying growled as he wrapped his hands around the woman's throat. She gasped desperately for air and clawed at the vice grip around her neck as the pressure increased. She was blacking out from a lack of oxygen, and her life flashed before her eyes as she stared into the menacing gaze of the man hell-bent on ending her life. In the visions, she saw herself bidding goodbye to her parents as she left her mountain village with a group of young people around her age. They each had a pack filled with their personal belongings. Together, they made their way into town through winding paths in the jungle-filled mountain. The scene cut to the young woman on a bus. It was nighttime when the bus came to a stop. Through the windows were buildings of many different sizes. Some of them were tall and rose beyond what she could see from the tiny windows on the bus. There were lights that glowed and flashed with the colors of the rainbow, illuminating the streets. Countless types of motor vehicles lined the roads with hundreds, if not thousands, of pedestrians coming and going. The next vision was during the day. The young woman was crossing a busy intersection as a car sped past the traffic light and slammed into her. It screeched to a stop, but not before hitting the woman. She never saw it coming. Her body laid still, sprawled over the middle of the street as blood pooled underneath the back of her head. Some of the onlookers swarmed over to check on her, but she was unresponsive. The first among them was a young man with a reverse baseball cap on. He had on a t-shirt with an apron over it. Beside him was an older lady who also had on an apron. A second later, they were joined by the others. The man with the cap phoned for an ambulance and motioned for the crowd to get back, and they did. An eternity later, sirens blared in the background as the vision blurred away. Chapter 2. When the young woman came to, she was lying in a hospital bed. There were half a dozen tubes and cables connecting her to beeping machines and monitors. Her head was wrapped in bandages, and her body was a massive bruise. She had no recollection of how she ended up in the room. All she wanted to do was go home to her parents, but she could hardly move and her legs weighed a ton. Suddenly, the door opened, and a man with a baseball cap stepped in. He had a plastic bag in his hand. They each looked at each other in surprise. The smell of cooked meat, spice, and herbs instantly filled the room. "You're awake," the man exclaimed. Who are you?" she asked, timidly. "Name's Blanc, and yours?" He sat down next to her, pulling a lidded styrofoam cup, 2 plastic spoons, and 2 bottles of water out of the bag, and placed it atop the tray beside her bed, with some napkins. "Ka," she answered. "All right, Ka. It's nice to meet you. I hope you're hungry. The doc recommended a soup diet for you until you feel much better, so I got you some congee. Hope you don't mind. Blanc produced a styrofoam tray from the bag and flipped the lid open. Inside was a mountain of fried rice, a quarter leg of fried chicken, and an egg roll. He grabbed one of the spoons, then pushed the tray with the styrofoam cup over to her. Go ahead, eat. Don't be shy now. Ka tried to unscrew the cap off the water bottle first, but was unable to do so. Blanc grabbed it from her and twisted the cap loose, all the while chewing on his food. He handed it back to her. She undid the cap, but took too huge of a gulp and started coughing. Blanc quickly placed his tray down, then rushed over to pat her on the back. Embarrassed, the woman blushed. After a moment, the young woman was able to regain her composure and said in a hoarse voice, Thank you. Blanc was in the middle of shoveling fried rice into his mouth, so he just responded with a nod and a squinty-eyed smile. Ka took the lid off the styrofoam cup, releasing the built-up steam from within. The congee looked unimpressive. It was plain, save for a few finely shredded bits of chicken. She dug a spoonful of the soup and blew on it several times before taking a bite. The steamy contents were surprisingly delicious. It probably would have been even better had green onions been added, but she thought it rude to complain. Ka had questions she wanted answers to, but couldn't muster the courage to ask, so they both ate their meals in silence. At least she knew the man's name, she thought to herself. Finally, Blanc broke the awkward silence. Are you a student? Ka nodded. You're not from around here, are you? No, Ka answered, her voice soft. First time in the big city? Yes. Ka wasn't sure where the stranger was going with the questions. And Nam Path is the biggest one in Chang'im, Blanc laughed. Okay. Sensing her apprehension, Blanc said, You should watch where you're going. People drive crazy here in the city. Mom and I saw the whole thing. The car that hit you belonged to the Chang'im ambassador, Kendara Wangsuwan. Supposedly, his driver was drunk and ran the red light. It was Ambassador Ken that paid for your operation. The medical staff discovered your heart was defective and you needed a transplant. Otherwise, you weren't going to survive. It was a good thing it happened in the public. I'd hate to imagine what would have happened if it wasn't. So that's what happened, Ka responded, putting a hand across her chest. She thought back to when she was a child. Ka always had problems keeping up with the other kids, and was never able to do anything too strenuous without being easily winded. Without looking at Blanc, Ka said, It all makes sense now. What does? Nothing, the woman replied, then quickly changed the subject. How long was I out? Blanc raised an eyebrow. A few days. You were in and out until now. My parents, do they know? I don't think so. The medical staff couldn't access your phone. Maybe it was for the best, she thought. She didn't want to worry her parents. There was a knock at the door, and a female nurse walked in. Oh, good, you're awake. How are you doing? She asked, washing her hands at the sink. I have a headache, and my body is sore, but I think I'm okay, replied Ka. I'll bring you some medicine, but first I have to check your incision and some other things, the nurse said. Blanc got out of his chair. Looks like this is my cue. I'm gonna head out. Mom probably needs my help. We'll come check on you later. Thanks for bringing me food. You have been very kind, Ka responded. Not a problem. You should be thanking my mom. I'm just her messenger. Blanc smiled as he waved her goodbye, then walked out the door, shutting it behind him. Sometime during the middle of the night, Ka was awakened by a sudden chill in the room. It made her shiver and her teeth chattered. She could see her breath in the air. Although she was alone in the room, she couldn't help feeling like there was someone else there watching her. Ka hesitantly scanned the room but could see nothing out of the ordinary. She pulled the blanket over her head and eventually drifted off to sleep. While asleep, she dreamt she was being chased through a misty forest during the night by an angry mob armed with guns. Bullets whizzed past, ricocheting off trees and tearing through branches around her. Then a bullet struck her from behind. She tumbled forward into the dirt and blacked out. Suddenly, Ka found herself in a makeshift operating room. In front of her were a few people in masks and surgical garments, operating on a woman strapped to a bed. None of them seemed to notice her, though. Curious, she walked closer to get a better look. She wrinkled her nose when one of them removed the still-beating heart of their patient and placed it into what looked like a clear plastic Ziploc bag being held by their assistant. The loud thumping heart could be heard from the operating room as if it was coming from a pair of speakers. Ka frantically inspected the area to pinpoint the sound. Then she placed a hand on her chest, thinking it was the source. It wasn't. The sound was coming from everywhere at once, getting louder and faster every second she remained in the room. It was driving her mad. She collapsed to her knees, with her eyes closed, screaming and cupping her hands to her ears, but it was no use. The sound was so loud she couldn't even hear her own screams. It seemed like the sound would go on forever, till it finally ceased. When Ka opened her eyes again, she was standing in a lake in waist-high water. It was night, and eerily silent. The only sound was of her wading in the water. She turned around and tried to return to shore, but something was terribly wrong. The depths of the water got deeper, and the shoreline seemed to stretch further with each step. Ka turned around and tried to go the opposite way, only to find herself in the same spot, with the water level now up to her neck. Soon her feet couldn't reach the bottom of the lake, and she flailed around in a panic. She yelled for help, but her head kept going under, and every time it did, she swallowed more water. It was like that until Ka was completely submerged in the lake. As she thrashed around, one of her arms came into contact with something. She glanced in the direction of whatever it was she brushed up against. To her horror, it was the pale and decomposing corpse of the same woman she saw in the operating room floating alongside of her. Ka flinched and screamed at the top of her lungs when the dead woman's eyes flew open and reached for Ka with her cadaverous limbs. However, the only thing she managed was a muffled cry as the dead woman seized her. Chapter 3. Hey, wake up! Wake up! You're having a nightmare, a distant, feminine voice called out. Ka felt her body being rocked gently back and forth until her eyes peeled to an unfamiliar face of a woman with her hands on Ka's shoulders. She let go and asked, "You okay, hun? You must have had quite a dream last night. You were moving around so much I thought you were going to fall out of your bed." "What time is it?" Ka asked in a raspy voice, ignoring the woman's question. "It's 7:46 in the morning. Anyway, my name is Dee. I'll be the nurse helping you this morning." She presented a white dress to her patient. "I was told to get you ready for the meeting. Look, they even delivered this lovely thing for you to wear." "Meeting?" "Ambassador Ken and the media are going to be here soon. It seems you're the talk of the town. Everyone's wanting to see how you're doing." The nurse went into the bathroom to prepare her bath. Ka started to bite her nails as she waited. It was always something she did when faced with anxiety or nervousness. Soon she'd be on TV, and everyone would know who she was. Everything just seemed so overwhelming. About an hour later, the ambassador and his entourage arrived, followed by all the major news stations. The whole room was packed with people. Some of them even lined up outside in the hallway. The ambassador was a tall, thin man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair. He had on a fancy gray business suit and a neatly trimmed mustache. "I'm Ambassador Ken, and you must be Ka. It's a pleasure to meet you." The man smiled and shook her hand firmly. It's nice to meet you, too," Ka responded meekly. The man took his time holding her hand as if posing for the cameras. Ka doubted the man heard anything she said. "I'm terribly sorry for the actions of my driver. I hope you can forgive me. I want you to know his actions will not be tolerated." It's okay." "What steps have been made to rectify this incident?" a reporter blurted out. "My driver's behavior and actions aren't a reflection of the administration. We don't condone what he did. Appropriate steps have been taken, and the driver has since been relieved of his duties," Ambassador Ken answered. "How are you feeling, Miss Ka?" asked one of the reporters from the back. "I'm, feeling better, thanks to the ambassador's kindness," Ka replied with an awkward smile. She wasn't exactly sure what she was supposed to say, but she had seen enough interviews on TV and was aware the whole event was staged to save face or stroke his ego, so she played along. There were so many reporters there she didn't know who had asked a question or which camera to focus on. "When are you expected to be released from the hospital?" another reporter called out. "Well, I haven't been notified when I'll be released, but, I'm hoping soon," Ka replied. "How about a picture together?" Ambassador Ken placed an arm behind her for a half-hearted hug. After a few seconds of flashing, clicking, and shuddering from the cameras, a woman stepped in to address the crowd. She had on a pair of glasses and a pencil skirt suit. Ka imagined she was the ambassador's secretary. The woman spoke clearly and loudly, making sure everyone heard her. That's all the time we have for today. Miss Ka needs to get back to her treatments. On behalf of the administration, we thank you all for coming out. With that came some murmurs from the crowd as they made their way out of the room. When the room finally emptied, Ambassador Ken bid Ka goodbye. Then he and his entourage made their exit. The young woman noticed they did so very methodically. 2 guards were stationed among the crowd and followed them out as they cleared the room, while 3 remained by the ambassador's side. She imagined there were more security personnel outside the hall as well. She found it interesting, the effort one had to put in as a public figure or an important government official. Regardless, she was glad the meeting was over. It only lasted about 5 minutes, but felt like an eternity. The whole ordeal was nothing more than a publicity stunt, she knew, but despite it, Ka was still a nervous wreck throughout the whole thing. It was quiet once again after the meeting, so Ka had time to reflect on her dream. It felt surreal, almost as if she had lived through those terrifying events herself. She hoped it was something she never dreamt of again, but something within her yearned to find out the meaning of those visions, especially who the mysterious woman was. She came into the room with a clear plastic portion cup. In it were pills Ka had been taking since being admitted to the hospital. Dee placed the cup onto the tray next to her bed with a styrofoam cup full of water. "Time for your meds, hon." Ka took the pills in one gulp with water, then handed the cup back to the nurse. Dee, what can you tell me about the donor?" "Unfortunately, we aren't allowed to give out that information. Besides, I don't know anything about it. Probably for the best, too." "What do you mean by that?" "I'm saying I'd rather not know. Sometimes things can get messy." "Why do you say that?" "All you have to know is we aren't allowed to give out that information, and it's for a good reason. I'm sorry, hun. I wish I could provide you with more information. Now, is there anything else you need?" Ka just shook her head, but she was still determined to find out more about the images in her dream. Perhaps there was someone else who knew the answers she sought, Ka thought. Chapter 4. The next several days, Blong and his mother continued visiting Ka. In that time, she learned the doer were also from a small village in the mountains, and that they ran a food stall on the side of the road for a living, which was also where she was hit. The 2 of them moved to the city so Blong could finish school, and have been there ever since. The man had been helping his mom run the stall ever since graduation. With her family being so far away, they continued to look after Ka. They were truly kind and genuine people, and she was grateful for them. Ka returned to her dorm to resume her studies after being discharged from the hospital. Although she kept a low profile, people in the streets and even some of her fellow classmates stopped and asked about the incident. It made her uncomfortable, but was something she knew she had to deal with, at least while it was fresh news. The attention will eventually pass, she kept telling herself. Even more troubling were the recurring nightmares, which enabled her to sleepwalk. Some mornings she woke up to her clothes, bed, and bare feet being covered in dirt and grass, as if she wandered off somewhere and came back, but she never remembered anything except for the dreams. She was also filled with an overwhelming mix of emotions that didn't belong to her, but was somehow part of her as well. The nightmares, Ka imagined, were the closest thing to a living hell, having to relive one's horrible experiences over and over again. A normal human could only take so many cruel and traumatic experiences. Ka felt like she was beyond her breaking point. She endured it for nearly a month, but they got so bad, Ka stopped going to sleep. She went almost a week without sleep when she started to question her own sanity. She started hearing voices and seeing things while awake. One night, while going over her notes from class, Ka heard the pleading cries of a woman from down the hall. "Help! It's gone! Someone took it! Please help me find it!" the voice cried. Ka paused for a second, then continued reading her notes. She heard the voice again, this time louder and more distinct. She ignored it, but the voice continued, as if it were a looped recording. Each time the voice came back, it got closer and closer until it was right outside her door. Ka plugged in her headphones, went to YouTube, and played some music from the Lo-Fi Girl channel. Suddenly, there came a thunderous boom at the door, and she almost jumped out of her seat. Shuddering, Ka slowly turned to the door and pulled the headset from her ears. "Where is it? I know you have it. Give it back to me." the voice shouted. Her blood turned to ice at the sound of the voice. She hardly wanted to breathe, afraid she'd give away her location. But her own heart betrayed her. It drummed loudly. Ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. Ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. You have it. I can hear it. It's calling for me. Give it back to me, the voice demanded. The door rattled and boomed continuously as the light in Ka's room flickered. She hopped onto the bed, which was by the corner, furthest from the door with the blanket over her head. She squeezed her eyes as tightly as humanly possible, while cupping her ears. She prayed intensely to God, to her ancestors, to anyone that would listen to her cry for help. Suddenly, the noise at the door ceased, and the light stopped flickering. Ka took a moment to listen, but heard nothing. She slowly removed a small piece of the corner and peered out from under the blanket. Her light was unusually dim, but what she saw next horrified her more than anything she'd ever encountered. There was a huge, dark puddle of blood pooling from underneath the gap of the door, with long strands of raven black hair crawling on top of it and into the room. An infinite amount of blood and hair kept crawling into the room until they reached the edge of the bed and formed themselves into the dreaded being from her nightmares. The corpse was naked and completely drenched in blood. There was a massive gash at the center of its chest, exposing part of the ribcage and lungs. The dead woman's skin was a pale gray color. It had long black hair that covered its breasts, but regrettably not its mangled and decaying facial features. The dead woman wore a vengeful eyebrow-furrowing scowl with its crooked lips drawn back, displaying a set of black rotting teeth. Its dead white eyes produced an eerie glow in the dim light as it glared at Ka. The malevolent energy radiating off of the being made Ka sick to her stomach. Without warning, the corpse lunged at her. Ka flinched backwards, bringing the blanket up to shield herself. She kicked and screamed hysterically for a brief moment, but nothing happened. Ka waited a little longer just to be safe before peeking outside. Everything in her room was back to normal, including the light. When Ka saw that the coast was clear, she jumped out of bed, slipped her sneakers on, grabbed her phone and books, and threw them into her backpack. She ran out of the door without even tying her shoes. Chapter 5. I'm literally down the street, Ka said into her phone. I'll be outside, Blung replied and hung up. Ka didn't want to bother him, but she didn't have anyone else. The trip to his house was a 15-minute walk. She was relieved he picked up when she previously called. At least something good came out of his late-night gaming sessions, Ka thought. She had never been out in the streets between 2 and 3 in the morning. She didn't know what to expect, but felt it was a necessary risk. Anything was better than being killed by a ghost. Most of the city was asleep, and the streets were mainly empty, with the exception of a few strips lined with bars and nightclubs. She was scared, but made it quickly past the drunk patrons stumbling around without any problems. The last thing she needed was a run-in with any of them. An alternative would have been the longer way around, but she didn't want to be out in the streets any longer than she had to be. The trek to Blung's was a trip full of fear and paranoia. Ka felt the vengeful spirit lurking in the shadows and around every corner. Its incessant voice echoed in her head, demanding the return of its heart. The same heart that kept her alive, but also served as a beacon of horror and dread. Despite how badly the night had been, it was all behind her now that she was at Blung's. Ka had been there a few times before. It was a small house he and his mother were renting. The house had 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. It wasn't the prettiest house, nor was it in the best neighborhood, but it was a roof over their heads, and for that they were thankful. When Ka got to the front of the house, Blung was sitting by the door. The man looked different without his baseball cap. He stood up as soon as he saw her, and she ran over to hug him. She held him tightly as she broke into tears, sobbing uncontrollably. Ka had never been happier to see someone. Blung was taken back by her reaction, but decided to hug her back. For as long as he has known her, she has always displayed very little emotion. She also didn't seem like the hugging type, but there they were, holding each other. She buried her face into his chest as she wept. He remained silent and held her. Blung didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. He thought it best to just let her have a moment. I'm sorry. You must think I'm some kind of weirdo, Ka said, still holding on to him. She felt safe in his arms and didn't want to let go. It's okay. After a few more seconds, Ka said, "Okay, I think I'm good. Sorry I got tears and snot all over you. She released her hold on Blanc to wipe her tears and nose as they both shared a laugh. It's no problem. Let's go inside. He opened the door and let her in. Ka took off her shoes by the door. Blanc went into the kitchen and came back with a glass of water. He offered it to Ka. She thanked him and took it. So, you want to talk about it? She shook her head. Not right now. I'd just like to get some sleep if that's all right. Yeah, not a problem. So, I'll take the couch. You can have my room. No, I can take the couch. I insist. Come on. He went over to his room, and Ka followed him. He opened the door and flicked on the light. Embarrassed, Blanc hurried in to pick up his clothes around the room. Don't mind the mess. Not at all. The room looks great. She stepped into it and looked around as if she were at an art exhibit. All the while, Blanc picked up after himself. She was already starting to feel better. Aside from a few pieces of clothing scattered about, overall the room was well kept. Ka was surprised by how clean it was. She never took the man for being neat and tidy, although she would never say it to him because it would be rude. She was 19 and he was 25, but he still very much carried himself like a teenager. Before, she thought guys like him were immature, irresponsible, and were slobs. But she couldn't have been more wrong. The man was considerate, caring, and responsible. She didn't know their history too well, but she knew Blanc's father wasn't in their lives. Ka never asked about him. She didn't think it was any of her business. Despite their struggles, his mother raised him well, and he was a testament to that. Next to Blanc's bed was a desk with a laptop, some books, paper, and a couple of photo frames on it. Various figurines sat on a shelf above the desk. The space in between the figurine shelf and desk was a corkboard filled with notes and pictures. On the walls hung a few framed art posters. She didn't recognize any of the figurines nor the characters on the posters, but one of the pieces stuck out to her. It was of a swordsman in a fighting stance with swirling flames around him. If she had his abilities and strength, she'd have no fear of any demons or evil spirits, Ka thought. This guy looks cool. He must be strong, Ka said, standing in front of the poster. Blanc looked up as he threw the last piece of clothing into the hamper. Oh, that's Tanjiro. I call him the sister's keeper. He wasn't always strong. He had to work hard, but yeah, he's cool. Is he your favorite? He's one of them. Which one's your favorite? Blanc's eyes lit up, and a smile crept across his face, almost as if to say, I'm glad you asked. He pointed to the poster directly across from Tanjiro. That one. It's Guts from the Berserk series. Ka glanced over. There was a man in a black suit of armor, with a tattered cloak. He had a massive sword over his shoulder. The man was scowling and stared at Ka with only one of his eyes. Yeah, he looks interesting, but why is he winking in this picture? Blanc chuckled. He's not winking. Though I'm sure he wished he was. He's only got one good eye. Oh, I feel stupid. Anyway, maybe you can tell me more about these guys another time. It's late. You and your mom have to get to the stall early. I'd love to tell you more about them, but I wouldn't want to bore you, is all. Well, if you need anything, just holler. You're welcome to sleep in. They each bid the other good night, and Blanc left Ka to her own devices. She was so exhausted she passed out shortly afterwards. It was the first good night's sleep she had since the accident. Chapter 6. The alarm from her phone went off the next morning, waking Ka from her much-needed slumber. She slept on her side, facing the wall. When she awoke, her eyes widened. Beside her was the top of someone's head poking through the blanket. Ka shuddered, swallowing hard as a knot formed in her throat, and her heart hammered loudly, threatening to jump out of her chest. Her hand quaked as she hesitantly reached over to remove the blanket, fearing what she may discover. Before she even had a chance to throw the blanket off, the figure rose up from the bed to reveal its ghastly self. It gave a spine-chilling moan as it reached for Ka. She reeled backwards and tumbled off the bed onto the floor, slamming into the computer desk in the process. The impact knocked over a photo frame off the desk, and it clattered onto the floor beside her. She crawled backwards on her behind, toward the opposite wall, glancing up at the bed, but the dead woman was gone. Resting her back against the wall, Ka curled herself into a ball and cried. She remained that way for a few minutes. Then she raised her head and shouted, What do you want from me? I didn't do anything. Stop! Please stop this! but there was no response. The picture frame on the floor caught her eye. Ka sat staring at it for a moment before she finally picked it up. She flipped it over and gasped. In her hand was a photo of Blung in the mysterious woman from her dreams in a police uniform. She was beautiful, healthy, strong. She was the complete opposite of the abomination that haunted Ka. She placed the photo back on the desk and hurried out of the room. Seeing the photograph of the woman in Blung raised even more questions, but she was determined to uncover the truth. On her way to school, she stopped by the stall, but only Blung's mom was present. "Good morning, Ka. Have you eaten?" The old woman greeted her with a warm smile. She was older than Ka's mom, but reminded her a lot of her own mother. Ka smiled back and shook her head. The old woman grabbed 3 skewers of meat and wrapped them in aluminum foil, then handed it to Ka. "Here, take this in case you get hungry." Ka refused, but the old woman was adamant, so Ka took it and thanked her. She debated if she should ask the old woman about the photograph, but decided against it. Instead, she asked, "Mrs. Lee, where is Blong?" "You just missed him. He said he had some errands to run. Blong should be back soon." The woman was now busy tending to a line of 4 people deep. "I should be getting to school now. I'll call him later. Thank you again, Mrs. Lee." Ka waved at her as she walked away. "Okay, bye, dear," Mrs. Lee called back. Later that evening, she called Blong to ask about the woman in the picture. There was a long pause. "Blong, are you still there?" Ka asked. "Yeah, still here," he said, voice shaking. The man sounded like he was crying. Then he continued. She and I were once close. Her name is Bao Yang. We were from the same village. She even lived with Mom and I for a while. We went to the same school and graduated at the same time. She always wanted to be a police officer. Then her dream came true after graduating from the academy." There was another long pause. He sniffled and continued the story. "I always told her she'd be great at it since she had the personality. She was always so strong and confident, but also very kind. Ba was never afraid to speak up for those who couldn't defend themselves. Mom used to say Ba was like the daughter she never had." "She sounds like she was an extraordinary person. Do y'all still keep in touch?" asked Ha. He paused to think about how she phrased the question. "She is, but we don't talk like we used to. Her job doesn't allow her to have much of a life outside of it." "So, when was the last time you heard from her?" "I don't know. Maybe 2 months. Why do you ask?" There was a long pause as if she contemplated on what to say next. Then she finally said, "I think something really bad happened to her." "What makes you say that?" "Just a hunch. Of course I don't have any proof, but I think we should at least file a missing persons report." Blong was upset after hearing what Ka had to say. A back and forth conversation ensued, and she eventually convinced him to go to the police station with her. The next day after school, Blong and Ka stopped by the police station to file a missing persons report. They expected a response right away, since Ba herself was a police officer, but they never heard back. Blong was quite shaken up, having to deal with the possibility that his longtime friend might be gone. As time went by, Bao's ghost was able to physically manifest itself outside of Ka's nightmares entirely, but it only came out at night, or appeared in the darkness, whereas before it appeared in spurts. At first, Ka figured out she had to sleep during the day in public places in order to stay up at night to avoid the nightmares, so she ended up sleeping on buses, in a library, or at a park. It didn't take long before the ghost figured out her plan. After it was able to take form outside the dream world, Ka tried her best to ignore the apparition, but it became more than she could handle. It can move and throw objects, disappear and reappear at will, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. Ka often wondered what other abilities it had. The spirit was dangerous, but what made it worse was the intense aura of malevolence surrounding itself. Whenever it chose to appear, Ka got really sick to the point she became immobilized. Bao's ghost was more so a demon than a ghost. From then on, she referred to it as such. Ka eventually made some inquiries for assistance from a shaman, and was referred to one outside Nampath, so she made a trip to visit him, seeking a way to get rid of the demon, or at least to receive some reprieve from the hauntings. He lived in a village an hour from the capital. When Ka got there, she didn't know exactly where his residence was and had to ask the other villagers for directions. They pointed her in the direction of the house on the edge of the village. She found the house and knocked on the door a few times. No one came to the door immediately, but she waited. A moment later, an old balding man answered the door. His eyes were a milky pale color. Ka figured the man was blind. He opened it just enough to poke his head out. It was almost as if he was trying to hide something inside or hide from something outside. "Could I help you, miss?" he asked, sounding distracted as he glanced in Ka's direction. She wasn't sure the man could see anything, but he did not seem like he was looking at her, more like through her. "Yes, I was told you could—" "I can't. I'm terribly sorry," he interrupted before Ka could finish her sentence. "What? But you haven't even heard what I was going to say." The man began to shift uncomfortably. I don't need to. I came all this way. Can you at least provide me with some help? Anything. Please." He paused to think about it, then said, "Sorry, miss. All I can say is it's got unfinished business and isn't able to pass on. You and it are linked. It's beyond my abilities. You'll have to find someone else. I have to go now." "No, wait!" she shouted, but he slammed the door on her before she could get another word in. A wave of hopelessness washed over her as she walked back to the car in defeat. Ka cursed in frustration. Dealing with visitations from a demon that made her ill and being force-fed nightly terrors started to take some sort of strange effect on Ka. She hadn't been feeling like herself for some time. She couldn't tell if she was losing part of her or gaining something new. It was as if there were two different people sharing the same body. She felt bolder and more sure of herself. She also acquired an obsession with working out and exercising. She started going for runs and doing calisthenics. During one of her nightly runs through a park, Ka was surrounded by 4 men. All 4 were at least twice her size, 2 of them armed, one with brass knuckles and the other with a knife. She noticed a white dragon tattooed on each of their forearms. She sensed she had seen it somewhere before, but couldn't remember where. Ka got into a fighting stance, constantly shifting and moving in order to keep her eyes on each man as they encircled her like hungry sharks. Adrenaline coursed through her body, and her heart drummed for war. Ka remained light on the balls of her feet, senses heightened and ready to spring at a drop of a dime. "Want to have some fun, sweetheart?" asked the man with the knife, wearing a sinister grin. Another chuckled. "I'm not in the mood," Ka replied. "Oh, but we can be quite convincing," said the brass-knuckle thug. Suddenly, the knife man lunged in first with a thrusting attack. Ka's body reacted on its own, as if she'd practiced years for the moment. She quickly sidestepped and countered with an inside forearm chop to the man's neck. He went down, dropping the knife as he clutched at the intense pain in his throat. The brass-knuckled thug charged in from behind with a looping haymaker. Ka turned and pivoted, stepping inside with her back to him as she trapped his attacking arm. She seized it, then used his own momentum against him for a shoulder throw. The man hit the ground, stunning him momentarily. 2 of the remaining thugs rushed her at once. Ka delivered a swift back kick to the one behind, buying just enough time to send the other man crashing to the ground by way of a back roundhouse kick. He lay motionless. The other unarmed thug recovered quickly and bear-hugged Ka from behind. By then, the brass-knuckled thug was already up. Ka struggled but couldn't get free of the hold. "Hold a bit still," yelled the brass-knuckle man. He closed in quickly, winding up his punch. But his opponent had other plans. Even in a bear hug, she managed to spring up and surprise the man with a front drop kick to his chest, knocking him on his ass. She then focused her efforts on the man still restraining her. An enraged Ka somehow tapped into a savage power hidden within her. The brown of her eyes turned an intense red glow, and she shook the man off with the strength of some otherworldly beast. He was tossed aside like a ragdoll, and she pounced on him at once, finishing him off by bringing her fist down on his face like the hammer of Thor. There was a sickening crack, and the man cried at the top of his lungs as he grabbed his face. Blood gushed from his nostrils and streamed down the sides of his cheeks. Ka did not have the luxury of savoring the man's agony, as she then turned her attention to their friend with the brass knuckles. The man threw his wrecking ball of a fist at Ka. She easily ducked under it and stepped behind him. Surprised, he paused to scan where she had gone. Before he could check behind him, she took hold of his waist with both arms and suplexed him on his head. The move was so quick and sudden, the man never knew what hit him. The whole fight lasted no more than 2 minutes. Ka fled the scene after dispatching the thugs. Her adrenaline was still pumping even after she got back to her room. There was no way she could have survived the attack under normal circumstances. Aside from a few action movies she'd seen, Ka never had any martial arts training nor such incredible strength before. She concluded the only explanation were the changes taking place within her since the operation. After surviving the skirmish, her curse seemed more like a gift. Chapter 7. After numerous calls to the police station after filing a missing persons report for Bao that went nowhere, Ka returned there with her patience thin. She wanted to physically harm the rotund officer before her. It looked like he would be more interested in a buffet than solving crimes. "I'm afraid there's been no update on the case," the officer behind the desk said casually. "It's been weeks. How the hell do you just lose track of your own officer?" yelled Ka. "I'm sorry. Wished I could tell you something else. Now if you don't have anything else, I'd like to get back to work," the officer responded. "That's not good enough. I need to talk to your superior." Everyone in the station, including a man in a white button-up shirt and suit jacket, overheard their heated discussion. While the others looked on from their desks and cubicles, the man in the button-up headed over to the scene. "What's going on here, officer?" Ka cut in before the officer could say anything. "What's going on is I filed a missing persons report weeks ago, yet nothing has been done about it. Everyone has been giving me the runaround. How does a police department lose track of one of their own? The person in question is Bao Yang. Maybe you've heard of her?" The man in the suit jacket looked around as if to see if the coast was clear. Then he grabbed her arm and dragged her with him. "Come on, walk with me." She shook off his arm. "Get your hand off me. I'm not leaving until something's done. Please, I promise to do everything I can to find your..." the man pleaded as he looked at Ka. "Friend," she exclaimed, finishing his sentence. "Right. I'll do whatever I can to find your friend, but you gotta come with me." "Please?" He was practically begging her. She took a deep breath, attempting to calm herself, then nodded. She wasn't able to make any progress before, and perhaps the man may be able to help after all. He walked out of the police station, and she followed him. When Ka stepped out of the police station, she glanced up at the sky and hoped it wouldn't rain on them. It had been cloudy all day, and now an increasing number of huge dark clouds gathered overhead. Good thing she brought an umbrella, she thought. The man introduced himself and offered a handshake. "I'm Detective Tao. Sorry we had to meet under such bad circumstances." She shook his hand as they walked alongside each other. "Name's Ka. It's fine, so long as you're able to help, then we're good." "About the case..." The detective paused as he thought about what to say next. Then he continued. "There's really no easy way to say this. Detective Yang and I..." "She's a detective?" Ka blurted out in surprise. "Yes. Listen, we were working a human trafficking case and have been in constant communication until about 2 months ago when all of a sudden everything went dark. I'm beginning to suspect the worst. She may be lost, but there hasn't been any evidence to support it. It's almost as if she just vanished, so right now I've got no leads. Nothing." "You waited this long to tell me? None of the officers couldn't have notified me sooner?" "I apologize. We wanted to exhaust every resource and check every possibility before making the call." Tao handed her his business card. "In case you find anything at all, let me know." "Thanks for the update. I'll call if I find anything," she said in the nicest way possible. Ka was still bitter about not receiving the updates sooner. They reached the corner of the next street, then went their separate ways. It started to sprinkle a bit on Ka's way home. She undid the fastener on the umbrella and opened it. As she walked, she pondered about the information from the detective. Everything made a lot more sense after his explanation. Ka knew Bao was dead. It was now a matter of finding her body and the killers. She wondered if solving the case would appease the demon, and in turn leave her alone since the blind shaman said they were linked. And was it possible to break it? Ka was starting to embrace and even liked her newly acquired attributes, and knew it was accredited to her new heart and the demon. Regardless of that, the demon may be the key to her freedom. If so, she would have to strike a deal with it, no matter the risk. The demon's visits were less frequent as of late, but that night it reappeared as Ka expected. She was ready, and even had the lights turned off to welcome it. Ka was meditating in the dark when a sudden chill swept through her room. She could see the glowing embers of its almond-shaped eyes, along with the demon's shadowy feminine form, as Ka's eyes adjusted to the darkness. I no longer sense fear in you, human, the demon said as it approached her. Why fear what is a part of me? To fear you is to fear myself, Ka replied. Wise words you speak. Just so we're on the same page, demon. I understand what has been done to you was wrong. Just know that I too share your pain and part of your memory, but you will not have my body as a vessel to do your bidding. However, I am willing to compromise, so what is it that you want, and will I finally be rid of you once your task has been completed? What has been done to me? You know nothing. The demon snarled, and a gust of wind brushed up against Ka, and she flinched. This transcends either of us, human. I admit, at first I wanted nothing more than to make you suffer, because you were my only outlet. But then I realized how selfish I was. Right now, there are countless others who are suffering the same as I or worse. Despite my nature, I haven't completely lost my humanity. If we work together, we can put an end to all of it. I'm sorry, I truly am, but it's not my job to save the world. However, I am willing to help. But I need assurance you'll leave me in peace when it's over. After the deed is done, I will leave you be. We both know that's not what you truly want. You'll be back to being the scared little girl you once were before all this happened. If that happens, so be it. I will deal with the consequences. Now then, let's get this over with. Bold words, human. We'll see about that. Close your eyes and prepare yourself, the demon said, as it extended its arm and placed a hand on Ka's head. Then, in an instant, thousands of visions flooded into her mind, flashing from one to the other. The memories were a compilation of Bao's training as well as her real-world experiences. They consisted of firearms, hand-to-hand combat, and operating a motor vehicle. After about a minute, the visions stopped flashing in Ka's mind. She opened her eyes, and the demon was gone. But she was transported to a room that she had never been to, yet it felt familiar. Her clothes were also drenched from head to toe. She glanced at her phone, and about 30 minutes has passed. Is teleportation not part of your powers? You literally took control of my body and dragged it through the rain, Ka said, annoyed at the demon. There's a limit to my powers, but my teleportation abilities don't work like that, at least not in the way you define it, the demon said, its voice echoing in her mind, as if communicating through a telepathic channel. The room had a window next to a neatly made bed. It was between two end tables, with the light turned on. Sitting on the bed was a cache of weapons, ranging from a sniper rifle, a submachine gun, 2 pistols, a pair of knives, and over 24 boxes of ammo of various sizes. There was also a black leather jumpsuit and a magazine vest. Can't we just call the cops? Asked Ka. They have the cops in their pockets. Besides, they won't do anything without a justifiable cause. These guys are smart, responded the demon. Gotcha. They don't shit where they eat and sleep. Who are we taking down anyway? The White Dragon Gang. I'm sure you're already familiar with a few of their goons. She thought back to the thugs she previously encountered. Each of them had a tattoo of a white dragon on their forearms. The demon must have known about her run-in because of their shared memories. She gathered as much. Ka had never taken a life herself, but after emerging with the demon, it made her somewhat numb to the idea. The fact that they were going to take out the scumbags from the White Dragon Gang fueled her bloodlust even further, her eyes burning with an intense red glow. Well, if those guys are a representation of what the gang is like, then vengeance will be ours, Ka said with a sinister smirk. As if right on cue, thunder clapped and lightning flashed, illuminating the whole room through the window. Chapter 8. It was a year ago since Ka and the demon merged together. She thought that they were going to take on the gang that very night, and in a sense they did. The demon told Ka she wasn't ready, so instead of taking down the gang, she started her training. Though Ka was competent with the weapons and memories provided, she needed to be better. For 1 year, she and the demon trained, honing her marksmanship and combat skills. She also learned to wield the abilities and tap into the demon's powers at will. It wasn't all training, though. They invested a decent amount of time staking out the White Dragon's operations and gathering intel. When the time came, she coordinated and collaborated with the police through Detective Tao using the dead woman as an alias. The tasks were easy enough, requiring a few phone calls using Bao's memories, including any additional intel she gathered, and of course, Bao's voice. No one expected the dead detective to be able to aid in bringing down one of the biggest crime syndicates in Chang'an. It was the perfect cover. Timing was crucial, so as the police raided the gang's operations, she focused on its leader, Ying, the man she trained a year ago to kill but was now on the verge of choking her to death. She couldn't breathe and wasn't able to tap into the demon's powers. Ka had to act fast. In one single motion, she seized one of the man's arms and pivoted off the side, bringing her legs up and over his head. The move caught Ying by surprise, peeling the man off of her and forcing him into an armbar. He tried to fight it off, but by the time he realized what was happening, his elbow had snapped in two. Ka rolled off the man to create some distance between them and buy time to recover from almost being strangled to death. She coughed and hacked violently. Both stood across the room with the length of the desk as the dividing line between each other. The knife was still embedded on the desk on Ying's side. Ka's back was to the busted window with the rain spraying on her. "Who gave up the detective?" she asked. Ying yanked the knife free. "My memory's not so good. You'll have to be more specific." "Who gave up Detective Yang?" "Could be anyone, I suppose. Everyone has a price. In my line of business, nothing is off the table when you need to pull a few favors. Might have had my guys call for a welfare check on someone's mother," the man said with a wicked grin. "You're disgusting," she exclaimed. Ka's heart caught in her throat. She was at a loss for words. The memories of the mother and son duo brought a tear to her eye. She couldn't believe the scumbag threatened innocent people to get to Bao. A tide of emotions overcame her, but none of them stronger than pure hatred and rage. Her brown eyes turned red like fire to iron. It blazed with more fury than she'd ever had before. "What is she to you anyway?" "I'm her avenger." The crime lord cackled in response. He held the knife in a reverse grip and dashed in for an overhead stab. Ka stood there unmoving, and the man's eyes lit up as the blade descended on its target. At the last second, Ka caught the blade in midair with her bare hand. The blade impaled it all the way through to the other side, blood bursting onto her face and spilled down her arm. Ka gave an earth-shattering roar as she bored her free hand into Ying's chest, ripping the still-beating heart free. The crime boss sighed once and released the grip on the knife, with his limp body collapsing onto the wet floor by Ka's feet. The last expression on his face was one of shock and awe. Chapter 9. In the morning, the housekeepers were welcomed by the sight of the massacre. The police finally arrived on the scene. Among them was Detective Tao. Police cars and other emergency vehicles encircled the roundabout near the manor. Tao drove down the private road and parked his car behind a vehicle furthest from the roundabout, then stepped out. He pulled a box of cigarettes from the inside pocket of his suit jacket and popped one into his mouth. He lit it, then took a drag as he headed toward the front of the house where an officer greeted him. "What's the status, Corporal?" asked Tao with the cigarette still in his mouth. "Bad, sir. Every member of the White Dragon gang was killed," replied the officer. "Any witnesses?" "I'm afraid not, sir. There also appears to be something strange with the bodies. It looks like all their hearts have been removed." "All of them?" Tao asked, exhaling a stream of smoke. "Yes, sir," the officer responded. There were two paramedics transporting a body on a stretcher toward an ambulance. Tao waved them down and walked over. He removed the sheet to examine the corpse. Then he went over to examine two others. And sure enough, all the victims had a fist-sized hole in their chest, with their hearts missing. "Sir, you'd better take this call," the officer said, handing Tao his phone. "This is Tao." He paused to listen to what the caller on the other line had to say. "What? That's impossible. I just spoke to her a few days ago." He rubbed the back of his neck and walked back and forth uncomfortably as he puffed on his cigarette. "Are you sure it's Detective Yang?" "Where? A lake?" "Okay, I'll be right over." He hung up and handed the phone back to the officer. Tao hastily got into his car, did a three-point turn, then drove off. That concludes my new story, Heartless. So yeah, I hope y'all enjoy it, and if y'all don't, leave a comment, and if y'all do, leave a comment. Tell me what y'all liked or didn't like about the story. It could have been better written, but I had to meet the deadline, so I wrote it as best I could. And I know in some parts of the story, my audio was kind of going in and out. I figured out what the problem was, but at that point it was pretty late, so I just kind of let it be. So I apologize for that. Anyway, y'all have a great day. A happy Father's Day if I don't get a story out, and thanks for listening.